Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Jeanne Porter King, who is the author, business leader, inspirational teacher, and speaker, and board certified coach. She brings her engaging style to audiences and draws on her faith and experiences in the marketplace to help her audiences connect to their purpose, authentic identity, and the power from leading within. Her latest best-selling book is titled Influence Starts with I, A Woman's Guide to Unleashing the Power of Leading from Within and Effective Change Around You. Her mission is to move people and systems to higher levels of effectiveness. She is a seasoned organizational development consultant with more than 2.5 decades of experience in consulting, coaching, and training in the areas including leadership development, diversity and inclusion, and communication. Welcome to the podcast, Jeanne.
Hello, Charles. Thank you for having me on. It is a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Thank you. And today's topic is going to be around inclusive leadership. I've been a participant in your programs. I love your model and framework. And it's such an important issue today with leaders that really we want to kind of unpack it a little bit more, give them more insight into this critical skill. So the first question is, how do you define inclusive leadership?
Sure. Now, before I define inclusive leadership, I think I need to give the context that inclusive leadership is really about the broader diversity, equity, and inclusion framework or processes of an organization. So I always define diversity as the presence of employees and leaders from a variety of demographic backgrounds and experiences. And it's really about the fact of human difference that we show up in all of our array of differences. And organizations have created a culture in which that diversity is both respected and leveraged. Equity then becomes that fair treatment based on differing needs. And because people from different demographic backgrounds may have different support needs or, making sure that they have fair and equal access to opportunities. And then inclusion talks about the environment itself in which all employees can be welcomed, valued, supported, and able to contribute to their fullest. Therefore, because I do a lot of work with leadership and leaders, I define inclusive leadership then as that type of leadership that is necessary to attract, develop, and advance a diverse workforce. So again, we get in our diversity to create and sustain an equitable workplace culture in which employees feel valued, can fully utilize their talents, and have access to opportunities and experience a sense of belonging. So inclusive leadership is that leadership that is necessary for today's organizations that value diversity, aim for equity and inclusion.
Thank you for that. And I'd like to just learn more about kind of your background and really what got you interested into developing this model and focusing on this critical leadership skill.
I have been a career organizational development consultant since right out of graduate school, my master's program. My first degrees are in industrial and systems engineering, which surprises a number of people. And I started working in some manufacturing organizations around then the socio-technical processes of an organization. That's how I got into organizational development, gravitated then towards training, leadership development, et cetera. I noticed that as a Black woman, and at the time, a fairly young Black woman, I was in a lot of organizational cultures in which I was not the majority. Oftentimes it felt like the outsider and began to, again, think from a system standpoint, how do we do this differently? Where are more people like me? How can we do this? And in one of my organizations, it was actually Mead Corporation at the time, they invited me to be a part of their corporate diversity initiative. And I remember gravitating toward it saying, wow, that's it. This is where I can make a big impact on this organization, clearly with my organizational development framework and tools, but knowing what it's like to be one of the outsiders can really make an impact. And I served on that committee for a couple of years and then ultimately chose to go back to graduate school to do a doctorate, not in the engineering sciences, but in the social sciences. And I wanted to study culture. I wanted to get the tools that really helped me refine diversity, equity, and inclusion and take it to another level. In those early days, there didn't seem like there were a lot of frameworks that we could use. And I wanted to find them and help create them. And that's how I got involved in then the DE&I effort at the level that I am now.
Thank you. And I'm sure there's lots of data supporting the fact that inclusive organizations outperform less inclusive organizations on a number of metrics, right?
There are. I'll highlight a few. There's a book, I have to just give credit to Korn Ferry, The 5 Disciplines of Inclusive Leaders. One of the authors of their books, Andreas Tappe, is a colleague that I've worked with for some time. And in their book, they cite that diverse and inclusive organizations are 70% more likely to capture new markets, and that leads to higher growth. 36% more likely to outperform on profitability, 75% more likely to get ideas to market, 19% more likely to have higher innovation revenue. So we know that inclusion is valuable. In fact, what I really was an aha when I read and studied their book is that because I've done so much leadership work, and remember, I've integrated my organizational development and leadership development with diversity, equity, and inclusion, they've done the same thing. And they now cite that inclusive leadership is necessary for more equitable organizations. We would get that from my definition. But the part that really thrilled me is they are now also citing that inclusive leadership is foundational for broader leadership effectiveness. That many of us that do leadership development work and leadership effectiveness, we can look at trait theory, we can look at competencies and skills. We've studied and sliced and diced leadership in so many ways. They're now saying in this very multicultural milieu in which we now live and lead, inclusive leadership is foundational for broader leadership effectiveness. And I think we need to celebrate that.
I would definitely agree with that. And that's so great to hear. And let's now get into some of those practical things that will build a more inclusive leader. Because all of us have blind spots, and we all have a number of heuristics or rules that our minds use to reflexively think about these perceptual processes. However, these rules, we go from selection to interpretation without much time for reflexive thinking. Why so often do we do this?
Great, great. Now, for me, I talk about implicit bias. And it's because of the implicit associations that we make that become then heuristic and rules oriented. We fall on them almost on automatic pilot. And for me, because of, again, this communication and cultural background that I come from, what I recognize is there's a perceptual process that we each hold to. In my early communication courses, my doctorate ended up being in communication and culture. We help students recognize that our perceptual process is like a perceptual ladder. We select information from the broader context in which we're in, we organize it, and then we interpret it, and then we act upon it. What we now know is that we can go from select, organized, interpret in nanoseconds. And what we select is informed by the broader culture that we're part of. So I often would tell people, especially back in my old engineering days, I'd walk into a large company-wide meeting and I'd look around and I'd look for other people who look like me, either Black women, women of color, or Black men, men of color. I was looking, selecting. That's based on my cultural context of who I am and, looking for like-minded. I'd organize and interpret, make some decisions. But your cultural context can be, again, the culture that you inherited that shaped you. It can be the broader popular culture. So the means and themes of society will often reinforce more stereotypes and cause us to select in a very narrow way, cause us to organize in stereotypic ways, cause us to interpret and enforce judgments in ways that are hurtful to other people, and then act in those ways. And so we talk about the mind reflexively going up that ladder instead of slowing down, reflecting. So even in those days when I was looking for other women and men who looked like me, my first thought could have been, well, this is not a very inclusive organization, or this is a gender biased organization. There's not a lot of women, or it's a racist organization because there aren't a lot of people of color here. Slowing down knowing that I have an organizational development background, my thinking and slowing down was, they have great opportunity here to change. And then being invited, I may have influenced my way into being a part of the diversity committee because, again, organizations look for people who can help make a difference. And so that's one way to slow down that ladder, think about what I can contribute, and not totally fall for the memes and themes that come from, again, the broader culture. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And that's a great framework to follow. There's also a great book out titled Blindspot that explores these hidden biases that we all carry from a lifetime of exposure to cultural attitudes about age, gender, race, ethnicity, and the list goes on and on. And they reveal these hidden biases based on you taking certain tests, which they call implicit association tests. And I know that I was surprised by the hidden biases that I have, not even realizing it from taking some of these tests. How can these tests help any individual uncover these hidden biases that they have just due to their exposure of in life of
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. The book you're referring to is Blindspot, Hidden Biases of Good People. I think it was published in 2016. I've used it for quite a while. The authors are Dr. Mazarin Banaji and Dr. Anthony Greenwald, and they're social psychologists. Whereas I come out of communication and culture, they come out of social psychology. But in some ways, there's some alignment in how we saw these biases. They studied prejudice. People, social psychologists, study prejudice and bias. And in the old days, my understanding as I read their book is researchers would just ask people, what are your biases about? And they name the group of people. Folks would tell them. And they recognized that it became less and less popular for people to name their biases about groups of people, especially specific groups of people. But they recognized that the prejudice in the broader culture or society as a whole hadn't gone down. The research was suggesting that people weren't naming these biases anymore, but the prejudice wasn't going down. So they wanted to develop a process that was more akin to what had people implicitly adopted. What were the attitudes, thoughts, and frameworks and mindsets that could reveal that those biases were still there? And so they developed the implicit associations test. And your listeners can take it at the Harvard.implicit site. As a matter of fact, I've been using it for 20 years now, and they have lots of research gathered from those IATs or implicit associations tests. And they developed in this book kind of the chronology, how they came about developing, and they share so many great stories. So I would encourage those listeners that haven't gotten it to get that book. But some of the things they find is that almost 75% of people who have taken the race implicit associations test reveal an automatic white preference. That because, again, of these broader cultural memes and things, they've internalized and made this association that white is good, Black is not. And 75% of people take some level of automatic white preference. It might be minor, it might be more intense. The interesting thing for me is that 33% of Blacks who've taken the test at the time they published this book, they do the same thing. And it says that we can internalize oppression. We can internalize racism because, again, it's about our thinking patterns, those automatic assumptions we make. In every culture, there's a stronger young equals good than old equals good. So there's this youth bias. And then there's often a gender bias, whether it's in science or whether it's in, again, other areas, but that men and women make a male equals science association. What I love, if you don't mind, if I can tell a short story, Dr. Greenwald shares that as he was testing, the algorithm, anyone who's taken the test, now you use the E and the I, they're looking at reaction time. Because if you have some kind of implicit associations, you're going to kind of act on those associations. So they have a series of tests. You're making these comparisons. You're sorting. Basically, it's a sorting activity. And as he was testing it, he's doing his E and the I, he's looking at these groups. And at one point he says, oh, this is really working. And then it hits him about his own responses. And he's like, oh, this is really working. because even in testing this out, it was revealing some of his implicit associations. Dr. Banaji tells in the book that she knows because so many of us can absorb messages, what I call means and themes from the broader culture. We can absorb it without thinking or examining our assumptions. She says what she did, at least at the time of the writing of this book, she would have in her screensaver that a rolling series of pictures of people from various cultures and backgrounds and abilities, etc., so that she is literally training her own associations to see all of this mosaic of people as positive and good.
That's great. And, just to emphasize, when we allow our cognitive and perceptual shortcuts to go unchecked, we make incorrect assumptions about people. And that fits really into stereotyping as well. So if you could just kind of unpack how does stereotyping fit into this, and then maybe some of the stereotypes that we hold that we aren't even aware of in general categories.
Fair enough. Fair enough. For me, the way I've come to understand it is when we, again, that perceptual ladder, we sort information, we gather information very, quickly from our broader culture, our environment. And mainly because our brain can take in a myriad of data points at any time, but our minds can't necessarily handle it. So we have these shortcuts that we, again, select things we're familiar with, or that culture creates a filter by which we select. But then when we go to organize it, I see stereotyping as an organizing function of the perceptions, that we have an interaction with a person or a group, or we bought into some messages from the broader culture or from media, and we then pigeonhole them into these categories. And the more rigid they are, we can then stereotype an individual from that category and attribute to them characteristics that we hold in the broader group. We've not examined our assumptions about that group. We go on automatic pilot about it, and it can be very insidious. And there's a number of them. One of the things I'd want your your listeners and leaders to hear is that in the workplace, this is often about two of the biases is this in-group and out-group. That very subtly, many of your leaders may have this implicit notion of who's in their in-group. It might be by race and gender or sexuality. It might be by age or ability, but it also might be as something as simple as region of the country or world another person has come from, or if they've gone to the same school that I have or have a similar degree. And we very subtly hold to these in-group and out-group characteristics that we are therefore beginning to stereotype people in these ways. And so we end up making decisions about recruitment based on these stereotypes that we've held on to. We make decisions as leaders about assignments we give to employees. We might think we have some of our go-to people that we can depend upon them, but there's maybe your go-to people hold more in common with you and are more like you than you realize. And you therefore left a lot of people out of getting developed in ways that you're developing your go-to people with just the assignments you're giving them. So some other ones that are broader about people's demographics, it might be body type. We often in some of our workshops talk about some people can draw conclusions about how disciplined or lazy a person is just based on their body size. And so we may judge a person's friendliness based on their height and even their shape. Very subtle ways that our broader culture has shaped how we look at other people. Another one might be accents. An individual's accent can lead to assumptions about a person's intelligence, competence, or educational level. One of my first DEI diversity groups that I worked with, I was working my way through my doctoral program. And I did consulting with a woman who was the owner of a consulting practice who brought a number of us on. And she was tall and stately, but she was from the UK. So she had this wonderful, in this case, Scottish accent. And she said she would check in here in America. She'd check in at the hotel, and the person who checked her in, she said more often than not, someone would say something about her accent. And one time, one young gentleman said, "Oh my goodness, you are just so smart." And she says, well, what did I say other than here's my American Express? And it was her way of showing that there's some biases even around which accents are considered positive in this country and other accents that are not. There's others that we could share. Won't go into more, but they happen around race, gender, sexuality, ability or disability, family status, you name them. And we've got to explore all of those categories when it comes to the people in our teams and our departments to make sure we're not attributing certain characteristics to them based on stereotyping.
That's great insight. I want to leave enough time to unpack your model, which is a great model for mitigating implicit bias, which you call the 3R strategy. And the first phase of that is to recognize or become aware of the assumptions that you're holding, correct?
That's exactly right. Because at any time, any of us can make these shortcuts in our, we've just done it for so long, we forget about it. It's like, where do you drop your keys when you walk into the house? And it's just habit. So, what do you buy into? And it's just habit. Make assumptions, the stereotypes, you name it. So we become aware of it when we recognize that we've done it. And we have to do that in number one, becoming aware of the assumptions that we make, especially as it relates to those people biases, especially those in-group, out-group biases that I talked about. And what you want to do is take note of any unintended outcomes you might have by something you said or did. You may make a comment and it looks like a person may have shirked back a little, maybe been a little offended. You want to pay attention to those unintended outcomes. Or as I said, with your tendency to go to your go-to people, the people who look like you or from your background, the unintended outcome is that you're also not developing people who are different. The other way that you come to recognize these biases is when you get feedback, that someone on the team or in the department or a colleague gives you feedback that what you said may not have been the most helpful or may have been stereotypic or may have been biased. You want to be able to hear and receive the feedback and learn that you can gain insight from others. So the first is recognize.
And that's difficult. And the second phase is equally difficult, perhaps more difficult for me, because I find that I'm more reflexive in reacting to something impulsively than I am reflective and slowing down to stop that automatic process from continuing. What are some tips that you can provide our listeners for this phase?
Yes. First is carve out time to reflect on your day, your week, and pay attention to the feedback people have given you, or again, those unintended outcomes or consequences that you've seen. So I say you got to slow down the automatic process. Resist scurrying up the ladder from select, organize to interpret. Slow it down and pay attention to what you select. Pay attention to who you're attending to. Pay attention to who's speaking in meetings. Pay attention, right? And then uncouple stereotypes that you become aware of. You've been given feedback that you tend not to call on any women, or when a woman is interrupted in our team, you don't go back to get their insight. What linking have you done? What stereotype have you bought into about the women on your team? Uncouple that stereotype. Unpack the assumptions related to people who are in my group. I've assumed that they're wiser, they're more go-getters. I perhaps have unconsciously or implicitly assumed people that are not part of my group membership, they're not as much go-getters, and therefore I don't have to give them as many opportunities. The key is reflect on it and then shift your perspective to think about the situation from the other person's vantage point. What I'll often coach leaders to do is carve out, if they're working with me as a coach, we typically in leadership and executive coaching have twice a month that we meet for an hour, and I then coach them after they're finished is, where will you carve out time to think about your thinking and do some of your own coaching? Is it weekly? Is it monthly? Some people need daily to carve out 30 minutes a day at the beginning or at the end or at lunchtime to do this reflection. But that's how you slow down the automatic process from scurrying up that ladder.
Great. The third and final phase is to remedy these biases by implementing strategies to foster unbiased decisions. Could you provide our listeners some practical tools and tips? I know you provide a lot within your program to really help them mitigate some of these biases.
You have to. So again, the first thing is personal remedies, personal changes, personal things that you can do as a leader or that I can do as a leader. And it might mean taking some additional implicit associations tests. Begin to find out where your blind spots are. Work with some people in your team to get to know them better from a cultural standpoint. Have some more informal conversation. So do some personal read. I read a lot of literature from authors of different cultures than my own. There's on PBS or Netflix a number of great cultural documentaries. Do that. There's on PBS or Netflix a number of great cultural documentaries. Do that to learn the personal learning. From a system standpoint, we've got to put in processes that allow us to create that inclusive culture and to mitigate the bias that may come from any individual. So a good example is in talent acquisition or recruiting. When we're interviewing people, make sure that we use panel interviews, that an individual is going to be interviewed by multiple people from the department or the team. And then we come together to discuss our findings, rate them and discuss our ratings. We talk about behavioral interviewing. That is a great way to mitigate some bias in interviewing. In developing people on your team, pay attention to your go-to people. Who are they? And who else can you begin to develop? And who can you give opportunities to? So the key is really beginning to look at all of the people, decisions, and people processes from talent acquisition to providing, giving assignments to advancement decisions and looking at where the biases may creep in and then developing some solutions at the systems level that can mitigate that bias. And that will often mean having more group decisions for each of those areas.
It's a great model, and there's lots of great tips that you shared with our listeners. So thank you so much for that. As we reach the end of this episode, I always like to end it with a call to action. So Jeanne, is there one thing that you would recommend our listeners starting first in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I would. I would first of all invite them to explore and unpack their own culture. Too often we see diversity, equity, and inclusion about creating space for the other and that the other has a culture. But the reality is we all hail from a culture. And the more insightful and intentional and reflective we can be, we then can have some insight in another person's culture and accept the differences and commonalities that we have. So diversity really is about accepting the differences and commonalities and not judging them. So the way we can begin to do that is becoming more self-aware and self-reflective of our own culture, and then applying some of that learning as we listen and learn openly to people from other cultures. So that's one. Two is take some of those implicit associations tests. Let them help you reveal where some of your blind spots are. And then wherever they are leading, find out what their company's commitment is to DE&I. Reach out to their DE&I team, committee, or leaders. Find out what programs and processes are in place that the leaders listening to your podcast can get involved in. Even get the opportunity to learn, go through some other workshops, but become part of the change, part of the leadership impact of helping to create these more inclusive cultures.
Wonderful, Jeanne. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been such a great discussion with you in this critical area that's really leaders need to be more aware and to make more movement on. So thank you.
You are welcome.
Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you.
Yes, I'd love to hear from them on LinkedIn, Dr. Jeanne Porter King, on Instagram, Dr. Jeanne Porter King. And then my company, if anyone's interested on any work for corporate work, transportergroup.com.
Thank you again. And this concludes this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. If you'd like to subscribe, this podcast can be found both on Apple and Spotify. It can also be accessed on the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. And until next time, remember, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes a difference. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to share with others and post about it on social media. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which has video recordings of all the episodes of this podcast, along with bite-sized segments called single servings that are designed to answer your most pressing leadership and management questions. Remember, until next time, it's not what you know that counts, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.